In ancient Rome, one emperor showed the world just how far cruelty could go when lust and tyranny mixed together. His name was Tiberius, and his story is one of the most disturbing chapters in Roman history. Tiberius wasn't supposed to be remembered this way. Born into the powerful Claudian family, he was a brilliant soldier. He fought campaigns in Germany, expanded Rome's borders, and earned the respect of his legions. To many, he looked like a man destined to be a great emperor. But Rome was a city that devoured even its best men, and Tiberius's rule slowly twisted into something darker than anyone could have imagined. When Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, died, Tiberius inherited the throne. At first, he ruled with discipline, keeping the Senate in check and securing the empire. But power has a way of peeling back a man's soul, and behind the mask of order, Tiberius had urges that would come to define him more than any of his victories. Rome was a city that thrived on whispers, and soon rumors spread like wildfire. Tiberius was cold, distant, and cruel. He distrusted everyone, even his own family. His paranoia grew until he withdrew from Rome itself. In 26 AD, he abandoned the capital and fled to the island of Capri, a rocky paradise in the Bay of Naples. From that moment on, the emperor cut himself off from the people he was supposed to rule, and there in isolation his darkest desires consumed him. The Villa Jovis, Tiberius's palace on Capri, looked like heaven on earth. It stood on high cliffs, overlooking the endless blue sea. The marble floors gleamed in the sunlight. Fountains whispered in the courtyards, and servants waited at every corner. But behind those walls, behind the laughter and music, something far more sinister took place. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Tacitus tell us that Tiberius used Capri as his private stage of corruption. He surrounded himself with young boys and girls, forcing them to take part in acts so humiliating that Rome itself shuddered when the stories reached the city. He treated their innocence as entertainment. He staged twisted games. He demanded obedience not only from senators and soldiers, but from the most vulnerable people under his power. And it didn't stop there. They say Tiberius decorated his private chambers with paintings and carvings of grotesque acts, using them as instruction for the abuse he demanded. His gardens were not places of beauty, but arenas where human dignity was stripped away. The emperor of Rome, master of an empire stretching across the known world, reduced his power to something obscene. The whispers gave him a new name, the Old Go to Capri. It was a name laced with disgust and fear. To the Romans, goats symbolized lust without control, and Tiberius lived up to it. But these weren't just idle rumors. For many, they were a death sentence. Because anyone who resisted the emperor's pleasures could disappear, thrown from the cliffs of Capri into the sea below. Think about that. The same cliffs that gave him breathtaking sunsets became execution grounds. At night, the waves below carried away the screams of those who dared to defy him. And while Tiberius indulged himself, Rome suffered. Trials for treason became weapons. Senators lived in terror, afraid that a single word against the emperor might condemn them. Families were destroyed, fortunes seized, and blood spilled in the name of protecting his paranoia. Imagine living under that rule, knowing that the man at the top, the ruler of the greatest empire in the world, cared more for feeding his obsessions than for justice, for honor, or for the Roman people. The truth was this. Tiberius had turned his empire into his playground of cruelty. His villa was his prison, but it was also his kingdom of shadows. And the more he tried to satisfy his desires, the more monstrous he became in the eyes of his people. But here's the irony. In Rome, power and cruelty often walk hand in hand, but they never last forever. The seeds of Tiberius's downfall were already being planted. Senators whispered of rebellion. Generals mocked him behind his back. Even within his palace, servants and soldiers carried stories of what they had seen, stories too horrific to remain hidden. The emperor thought he had silenced Rome by hiding on Capri. In reality, every rumor spread louder than his decrees. Every cruel act chipped away at his legacy. And slowly, Rome began to wait for the day this monster, this self-exiled ruler, would face a death as twisted as the life he had lived. Tiberius believed he had built himself a paradise where no one could touch him. But history shows us something different. When rulers abuse their power, when they destroy lives for pleasure, their end is never peaceful. It is soaked in betrayal, humiliation, and fear. And that is where our story turns next, from the heights of his cruelty to the shadows of his final days, when even the mighty Tiberius discovered that no man, not even an emperor, can escape the judgment of time. This was only the beginning of his fall. As the years went on, Elagabalus did not change. He grew bolder. He began to flaunt his private life in ways that shocked even the most tolerant Romans. Imagine a city where gladiators bled in the arena, where statues of naked gods stood tall, where debauchery was common, and yet, somehow, Elagabalus managed to shock them still. His palace became more like a twisted stage, where his desires and strange practices were the main show. He forced senators, men of Rome's greatest dignity, to watch humiliating performances. He brought women of noble birth into his palace and stripped them of all honor, forcing them to play roles in his fantasies. Roman citizens whispered of his banquets, where guests never knew whether they would be served food or mocked, degraded, and dragged into his games. But his most notorious obsession? Power over women's bodies. For Elagabalus, women were not partners but tools of his hunger. He would lure them into the palace with promises of wealth, status, or favor, and once inside, they were trapped. Many were forced into acts they would never dare speak of again. These practices were whispered in Rome's streets like a curse, stories too shameful to write on stone, yet too horrifying to forget. The empire held its breath. For Rome, this was not just a private scandal. It was a threat to order itself. When the ruler lives without restraint, the city trembles. Senators began plotting. Generals murmur behind closed doors. The Praetorian Guard, the emperor's own protectors, grew restless. Still, Elagabalus pressed on. He desecrated temples, replacing sacred rites with his own twisted rituals. He demanded that Rome worship his sun god, Elagabal, above Jupiter himself. He even placed sacred Roman treasures in his temple and forced priests to bow to his foreign god. But while his religious crimes angered the Senate, it was his treatment of women that lit the flames of hatred hottest. The story spread like wildfire. The emperor who turned the palace into a brothel, who demanded noble women obey his every whim, who laughed at their suffering as if it were entertainment. Even for Rome, famed for decadence, this was too much. And then came the breaking point. Elagabalus, perhaps believing he was untouchable, began humiliating not just strangers, but his own family. He insulted noble matrons, dishonored daughters of the Senate, and turned the very women of Rome's elite into victims of his nightmarish desires. That was when even those closest to him began to turn. His grandmother, Julia Misa, who had placed him on the throne, realized that her grandson was destroying the dynasty with every passing day. She began to shift her loyalty, whispering instead to his cousin, Alexander Severus. Alexander was young, promising, and, most importantly, untainted by scandal. He became the shining alternative to the horror that was Elagabalus. The Praetorian Guard, always watching, began to favor Alexander too, and Elagabalus sensed it. He grew paranoid, desperate to hold on to power. He plotted to remove his cousin, but fate was already closing in. One day in March of 222 AD, the tension snapped. Elagabalus and his mother fled to the Praetorian camp, hoping to win the loyalty of the soldiers. But the soldiers had made their choice. They turned on him, the once feared emperor, who had forced Rome to endure his grotesque practices, now stood abandoned. No palace walls, no god's altar, no corrupted banquet could protect him now. The guards fell upon him with fury. He was dragged out, beaten, mocked, and finally killed, his body mutilated as if to erase his shame from memory. His corpse was paraded through Rome, stripped of dignity, then thrown into the Tiber River like garbage. It was an end as brutal as his reign had been. But here's the chilling truth. Elagabalus' death wasn't just punishment for his politics. Rome had tolerated cruel rulers before. What Rome could not forgive was how he desecrated women, how he made the empire's noblest families live in fear of his twisted appetite. His horrific practices, his obsession with degrading women, were what etched his name into history's darkest chapters. And as his body sank beneath the waters of the Tiber, Romans whispered a lesson that has echoed for centuries. A ruler may command armies, may sit upon the throne of the world, but when he abuses those who cannot fight back, when he crosses a line between indulgence and cruelty, his power cannot save him. So the story of Elagabalus lives on, a reminder how absolute power can twist into absolute corruption, and how even the mightiest emperor can fall. And perhaps the most haunting part? Elagabalus was only 18 years old when he died. A boy king who ruled Rome for just 4 years, but whose horrific practices made him infamous for all time. The empire would move on. Alexander Severus would take the throne. The temples would be cleansed. The people would eat bread again, without whispering curses about their ruler. But the memory of Elagabalus, of what he did and how he fell, remained burned into Rome's memory like a scar that never healed. Even today, historians struggle to comprehend the depth of his actions. Was he a madman, a boy lost in absolute power, or a tyrant whose cruelty was so unique that history could never quite forget him? Whatever the answer, his story stands as one of the darkest warnings in Rome's long and bloody history. So the next time you hear about the splendor of Rome, the marble palaces, the golden statues, the feasts and parades, remember also the shadows. Remember the story of Elagabalus, the young emperor whose horrific practices brought shame and ruin, and whose fall was as brutal as the life he forced others to endure. This was the emperor Rome could never forgive